The exposure mantra for black and white film was expose for your shadows and develop for your highlights. But black and white film is just the opposite of color film and digital cameras. In digital, we want to expose for our midtones and check our highlights. This means we want to search out the average reflectance or color or tones in the scene and zero out the meter on that tone. This will render our subject as average. Then we check by ensuring that important highlights are not blowing out. So the mantra for digital cameras is meter on the midtones and check the highlights. Meter on the midtones and check the highlights. That's the way we're going to approach this system. So in order to do that, we have to become familiar with the average colors and tones that we often see when we're photographing. Here's a short list of some common colors and some subjects you're likely to find. The 18% gray card tops the list. A good way to learn your average colors is to buy yourself a gray card and go out and compare its tone to other things. Take a meter reading off the gray card. Let's assume that it's something like 1/125th at f16. Well, go around and see what other things also read 1/125th at f16. If they're a match, then you know that's an average color. Over time, you'll begin to recognize average colors without even using your gray card. You'll just see them and know they're average. And each person will become familiar with a different set of subjects in color. For example, a portrait photographer is going to focus on learning skin tones or hair color, while a landscape photographer will learn the colors of the sky, trees, and mountains. So let's take a look at some photographs that include average colors. Here in this photo of the cans of paint, we have a perfect palette of average colors. Take a moment and note their brightness. These wooden buildings also provide us with a range of colors that are all average. Blue paint. Notice it's the same tone as your favorite pair of blue jeans. Not too bright, not too dark. The ubiquitous color of natural foliage. That's everywhere we look. Deciduous trees, healthy lawns, shrubbery. All perfectly average. This next slide shows us how close in tone foliage actually is. There's only a few standouts here. This green is a shade lighter. Perhaps instead of putting that at perfectly average, I might put that at +0.5. This green down in here is just a hair darker, and that's at about -1. And then of course we've got some very bright tones in these whites, and those are up around a +2 or a zone 7. But for the most part, the entire scene is made up of perfectly average colors. The reds, even these faded out reds down in here. This scene shows us a really nice difference between some greens. This is roughly your zone 4 green, maybe even a hair lighter, but I would probably put it in zone 4. Here's a zone 3 color up in here, and all this green grass and green foliage back in here, all right around average, zone 5. Reds. You're going to come across a lot of reds in nature, and these are all almost always average unless they're very, very deep red or very light red. You also see it in a lot of man-made subjects, such as bricks. Rusted metal. This orange tone and even this purple tone are all average. The only standout here is this light bit of yellow, and that's about +1. The blacks in here are around -1.5. For the outdoor photographer, skies are going to be a pretty common thing that we're going to come across and note and take our exposure from. So let's look at how the sky breaks up. About a third of the way up the sky, you're going to notice that it's a fairly average blue. I usually use this quite often for my outdoor exposures. Down along the horizon, however, it's a little bit brighter. It's about a zone 6 or +1. And towards the top of the sky, if you're looking straight up, it's quite a bit darker, and that's about a zone 4. Now it's interesting to note here that we talked about red being an average color, and here it truly is. The red of the lighthouse is the same tone as the blue of the sky. Same thing here. Take your average tone, your average meter reading, right off the blue of the sky. And again, down towards the horizon, we can see that the sky is significantly brighter. And at the top of the sky, it's a zone 4. Compare the blue of the sky in its average sections to the red, another average tone. Your pine tree here is a -1. Even the red in here, you could call that a zone 4. Notice how this tone is very similar to the blue of the sky over here. Once you become familiar with the average tones that you often encounter, it's time to look at the lighter tones and become familiar with those as well. Here's a short list of some brighter colors and objects that would fall into zone 6, or +1. Notice that the colors are mostly pastels, pinks and yellows, very light reds and greens, light purples and light blues. Another photograph of cans of paint. Another perfect palette of zone 6 colors. Notice that they feel brighter than the average tones, but they certainly don't feel as bright as, say, white snow, which would be a zone 7. They're kind of right in the middle. Here's a wider view of our wooden buildings. To shoot this scene, you would zero the meter on the red color, and then when you move the meter over the yellow, you'll notice that the hash mark moves up to +1, indicating that the portion of the building will be rendered one stop brighter than the red color, which is perfect. Another yellow. When you put your meter over that, your hash mark should fall on +1. That'll give you a perfect exposure. Here's a lighter tone of orange. Lavender or pink. Also a nice +1. A host of shades of lighter color. Again with the lavender, even that whitish tone back here, and perhaps even this lighter yellow. They would all be right around zone 6. Once you've spent some time with the lighter colors, then you could start looking into the darker colors. I think that it's more important to know the lighter colors, as they're, I hesitate to say more important, but you're more likely to take a meter reading off of them because we don't want to overexpose our highlights. The darker colors fall where they may. So you're going to look more to the darker colors to get an idea of where they may end up rather than take your exposure off the darker colors. This list shows us a few of the darker colors that you might run across. Dark blues, dark greens, browns, foliage, evergreen needles, dark tree trunks, deep blue sky, fairly dark skin. A few photographs showing those darker colors. They feel richer than your average colors, deeper. Here's a nice dark blue. You take a meter reading in here, your hash mark should be set to -1. Notice how that dark blue differs from the rust. The orange rust in the top of the scene is about an average color. The white is about a zone 7. And this lighter blue down in here as average. Dark lava rock in Hawaii. Another zone 4. Notice how this isn't deep black, but it's certainly a little darker than average. Here's your average tone up here in the sky. Here's zone 6 along the horizon. Back to the trains. Here we've got zone 3s and 4s. This tone up in here, notice that it's not quite deep black, but it's certainly not an average tone. Zone 4. Down in here, as we've seen before, is our zone 3. Now let's take a look at our extremes. Our +2s, or zone 7s, and our -2s, or our zone 3s. These are the extremes, and they should be reserved for such as a bright white snow scene. Taking an exposure meter reading here couldn't be easier. You simply find the area that you want to have detail and adjust your camera till your hash mark is at +2. That'll provide you a perfect exposure. Everything else will fall into place. The white building again. We've seen this. We know that it looks really good at +2. Here in the flower, what you'd want to do is you'd look at the brightest area that you want to retain detail in and put that at +2. Everything else simply falls into place. On the darker side of things, -2. I probably wouldn't meter here because it's so dark. This is a black boat, and everything we're seeing is quite dark. So I could say this will fall into pure black with no detail, and that's okay because everything else is going to be rendered as a zone 3. Another perfect zone 3. Black with detail. Deep black. Here, by putting this area in zone 3, you'd find that this is probably going to fall up around zone 4 or 4.5. Everything in here is right around 4 or 4.5 when these very dark black areas are put into zone 3. So let's take a look at where skin tone should be rendered on the zone scale. Skin tone, of course, varies between people, but there are some general guidelines that we can follow. The majority of folks will fall in between zones 4 and 6. In this slide, skin is about average. Not real dark, not real light. And we can see that tonal difference when we compare it against the pink, which we know is about a zone 6, a pastel color. Also, you can see that the pink is very bright in this area, roughly a zone 7. Not quite as bright as a blown out area, but also very bright. Mainly when I'm metering for portraits, though, I'm concerned with my skin tone and ensuring that no very bright areas blow out. This skin tone that we're looking at is a little bit brighter than average. Take a meter reading on that cheek and we can see it comes up to about +0.5. Am I worried about the white in this case? Not so much. Very small little area. The portrait, the skin tone, the smile, the look, that's what's most important about portraits. Here we're looking at about a +1 or a zone 7 skin tone. Zone 6. And when we meter on a nice area of the forehead here, it does go up to about a +1. All the colors are rendered accurately. Again, the background here, whether that's too bright and blowing out, is not really a concern. The faces, the smiles, the looks, that's what's most important about a portrait. Slightly darker than average skin tone. Here we're looking at about a -0.5. And sometimes skin can be quite dark. Here we're looking at -1. maybe even -1.5. And a good way to judge this is compare it to the real dark black in the background. This is extremely black. So we know this is probably not quite down to zone 3. Zone 3 would be approaching this depth of black. So -1.5. Here's a bunch of skin tone all put together to help you get an idea of where it should be rendered. Slightly lighter, +0.5. Slightly darker, -0.5. +1. -1. And another +1. And if I was metering this portrait, I would also probably check the shirt up here. It's quite bright, and that's a large enough area that I wouldn't want it to be blown out. So take a meter reading up there and make sure that it's not blowing out. And here we can see it's probably going to fall into a zone 6.5, maybe even a zone 7. In either case, it's going to be fine. So let's look at what would happen with these skin tones as we metered and looked at our display in the bottom. +0.5, -1, +1, average, and +1. So now let's look at how we would evaluate some common scenes. Find the average tone, zero out the meter on that tone, and then check the highlights to ensure they're not blowing out. So again, our mantra for digital cameras is meter on the midtones and check the highlights. Let's see how that works. Here we have a scene where we have several different tones. We have some averages, we have some brights, and some darks, and our camera is set to aperture priority, which is not my favorite setting, and I'll show you why. We start by metering an average tone, and the camera tells us we're at 250th of a second at f11. So we check it against other tones. Blue sky still reads 250th at f11, no problems. So really we want our exposure to be 1/250th at f11, but when we go to check the highlight, it suddenly jumps up to 1,000th at f11. And the reason it's doing this is because aperture priority is designed to always give you a good exposure, and so it's going to change on the fly. It's now seeing this very bright area and thinking, gosh, this is quite bright. The only way that I can make it a middle tone value is to close down by a couple stops, and it does so by setting itself to 1,000th at f11. But really we know that the exposure should be 1/250th at f11 because that was our average tone. If we shot it at 1,000th at f11, it would become quite dark. So when you recompose your shot, your numbers may change again, depending on what is behind your meter. In this case, it still says 1,000th at f11 because it's quite bright. So what you'd need to do is to pull up your exposure compensation dial and say, please, Mr. Camera, give me some more light. And you'd put it towards the plus. You go to +1, now it reads 1/500th at f11. And if you brought it up to +2, you literally would be placing this tone and putting it in +2, and now you're back to 1/250th at 11, which is where we started. So aperture priority works pretty well, and aperture priority and shutter priority would work exactly the same way. However, there might be a few extra steps. The one thing you could do is an exposure lock instead of using the exposure compensation dial, and some people like to do that. I'll show you my preferred method. It's using manual mode. The only trouble with manual mode is it's going to shoot wherever you left it last. And in this case, let's just say my camera was set at 1,000th at f11. When I put my meter over the average area, it's saying this tone is going to be this dark, and we know this is the place for zone 3. So we think, okay, that's not good. What we need to do is open up. So you open up to 250th at f11, and now that's an average tone. Well, this is exactly what your camera is going to shoot at. no matter where you're pointing your camera. So if you pointed it up here, it would still shoot at 1/250th at f11. If you pointed it here, it would still shoot at 1/250th at f11. But it's now telling us that this tone is going to be rendered in a zone 7, which is fine. We know that we have plenty of detail in that area. So we recompose our shot, 1/250th at f11, and we shoot. Seems to be a little bit less work doing it in manual mode, but everybody's going to find their own groove and find which way works best for them. In both of these cases, we got to the same place. It's just a matter of what you prefer. All right, mountains and flowers. Here, take your average green tone and zero out your camera. Then you could also check your highlights, which there doesn't seem to be too many bright highlights in here, but if we were to meter that, we would see that it goes up to +1. No problem. Our exposure is set, we've checked our highlights, and we can shoot. In this scene, you'd find your average, which is that green or that red back in there, and you'd zero out your camera again. Now you can check your brighter values. Well, that ends up being about +0.5, and if you go down to the brighter stairs, it goes up to about +1. No problem. Our exposure is set. We just shoot the shot. Here in this shot, I would look to the skin tone and put it about +1. And we check our highlights. Go up to the white of the hat, it goes up to about +1.5. Now the question would be, do we really need to meter this brightest part of the hat? Well, you know what? That's kind of small in the scene. And if I was to bring that down to give it a zone 7 exposure, everything else would become unnecessarily dark. So the question we have to ask ourselves, is that an important highlight? And I think in this case it's small enough that it is unimportant. So I leave my exposure just where I set it on the skin tone. We talked about blue jeans before, and here's a good example of a favorite pair of blue jeans. Take a meter reading off the average color blue and look around the scene. Is there anything a lot brighter? Well, probably not, but we can check. Look up into the sweater, and it's about a +1. Everything is fine. Here's a shot where I got fooled. I accidentally had my camera on matrix and I was just shooting away, and I finally realized that I was on matrix, and I thought, gosh, all my film was going to be overexposed. And so what I did was I looked to the average tone and put that at 0. Now, of course, all this area in the back becomes pretty dark, zone 3 or even darker. But in this case, it's not that much of a problem because we want the emphasis to be on the jumper. And so the black helps emphasize the white of the shirt. So it's not a problem. So we're left with having our exposure being set again on the average tone. Take a meter reading off the average in this scene. Again, green foliage. It's everywhere. And you could zoom over and spot meter the brighter tones. And it's only about a +1, which means it's zone 6. Not a problem. So what happens if your white value is overexposed? Well, let's see what happens here. In manual mode, take your average meter reading and zero that tone out. We get a 60th at f8, and we know our averages will be exposed properly, but we want to check our highlights. So put your spot meter over the white, and the hash mark is blinking. This is telling us it's going to be overexposed. So we need to let less light through. Stop down to 1/125th at f8. The hash mark stops blinking. We now know our whites will have detail. And in this case, I feel it's pretty important. You can always lighten up these values or lighten up these values. But when the whites are blank, you can't bring detail back. In a case like this, you can just look right to the brightest objects and say, well, gosh, it's important for me to have detail up in this area. So you take a meter reading there, and you could just set it straight away at zone 7. Everything else will fall into place. Of course, you can always check that. And here you can move your meter down and find out that you actually are in a zone 3, showing a little bit of detail in there. If that was not the case, you might change your composition a little bit. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. In a case like this, exposure is actually quite simple. You know you can't have this entire top area blown out. That'll just be too much. So we need to have detail in there. You put your spot meter in there, and instead of setting it at average, just set it right at +2. You now know that that will have detail, and all the other tones fall into place. Similar thing here. You can go to the brightest area, set it at +2, and everything else will fall into place. If you want to, you can always take meter readings down in here and down in here as well and see where those are falling. But if you want to ensure that this area here has detail, you need to place it in zone 7. In this case, I wanted to keep that nice brilliant orange, and so that needed to be average. But I need to check my highlights. And I come over here, and it's at +1.5. Not a problem, that's good. And I also don't want my shadows to be too entirely dark. So I'm going to bring my meter up there, and it shows me that's a zone 3. It works out perfectly. I can take my shot. I showed this shot in the beginning, and we talked about evaluating light. And here's a perfect example. An unlikely shot that normally I wouldn't have photographed unless I metered it. So take the meter reading off the sky here and zero it out. And then I'll go to my highlights, which are my yellows. And they fall into a +1. That's good. That's where yellow should be. I'm not going to meter the sun here because that's just way too bright, and there's no way I'd be able to get an exposure of that. So we let that blow out. And then you can actually poke around the scene and find other areas that are important to you. And this fell into a zone 3, and I thought, okay, I know that this area here is even a little bit brighter than that, as is this area. So the scene works out perfectly. We also talked about metering for using on-camera flash. In this case, I started by metering the average bricks and letting that be 0. That gave me an exposure of 1/4 at f13. Now, just as an aside, notice that I didn't meter the bricks that were here or here. Indeed, they may be average, but they're not in the sunlight. So you want to meter your average tones that are in the light. Moving my spot meter up to the brighter cream color in the top, I get a +1. Again, no problem. Everything is set now. 1/4 at f13 will give me a good exposure. But when I meter the shadow areas, I'm getting a blinking hash mark. This is letting me know that it's going to be pure black with no detail. So now you need to make the decision. Is that how you want your exposure to look? Which it may be. Or do you want to use a little fill flash to illuminate the shadows? In this case, I chose to use a little fill flash. Here's a similar example. In this case, I wanted a good exposure of both the indoors and outside. Of course, it's significantly brighter outside than it is inside. So I'm going to take my average tone in the bright sunlight, and that's the green outside. And when I do that, I know that these highlights and these posts and anything that's receiving sunlight inside should also be exposed correctly. But when I move to the shadow areas, I find that they're going to be underexposed. So, put on an on-camera flash, leave my exposure at an 1/8 at f11. That's going to give me a good meter reading for outside. And I set my flash to -1. You don't want to overpower the inside when you're using your flash. I could make this as bright as the outside by using my flash, but that wouldn't look natural. Our eyes know it's a little bit darker inside. So by setting the flash at -1 rather than at 0, enables that look. Now here's a case where the exposure was very simple. we've got our natural oranges up there, and gosh, the blue sky is probably about +1. This yellow tone is probably about +0.5. Average green's down in here. Exposure is simple. The problem is that when I metered the shadows, I realized that they were minus, who knows, -3, -4. They were very, very dark, and I knew they were going to be underexposed. So what I actually did was I recomposed this shot as you see it. The earlier version, the shadow encompassed much more of the frame, and that wouldn't look very good. For example, in a shot like this large area in here is in shadow, and I need that to have detail. So when I metered it, it gives me a zone 3. That works out well. But if that whole shadow area was black, like in the previous example, this would be a terrible image. It would be bisected, and that's not what we want in our photography. Now at this point, people start wondering, well gosh, can I fudge these numbers around a little bit, put things where they don't belong? So for example, if I was to meter the average tone here, this little mountain at sunrise, I'm getting a good exposure. When I meter down here into the shadows though, they're blinking and saying it's pure black. So one might say, well gosh, if I just opened up a little bit, I could get detail in here and still retain detail in here. But you'll notice the scene just sort of looks washed out. It's better to have a rich black and maybe trim a little bit out and use less in the composition than it is to overexpose your midtones and highlights to get the shot. Likewise, in a scene like this, I started off with my averages, or slightly brighter than averages, as sandstone is a little bit brighter. And when I metered the shadows down here, I found that they were blinking and underexposed. So this is just way too much shadow area to include in the composition. So instead of changing my exposure, I just changed my composition. Now we have less black. You could even take that a step further and trim even more out. All the same exposure. Just your composition is changing to control the amount of black within the scene. Sometimes, however, you can get away with overexposing your midtones though. In this shot of the gorilla, I took my meter reading here and got 500th at f4. When I metered down into the very dark fur of the gorilla, however, I realized it was underexposed. So I knew that I was going to need to open up some to let more light in. So open up to 250th at f4, and it stops blinking. So what I did was I recomposed the shot and shot it at a 250th at f4. Now you can see the greens are being rendered significantly brighter. But because the subject is the gorilla, I'm not so concerned that this is getting a little brighter than it should be. The Bellagio fountains. Metering the average tone in here, I set my camera and I knew I'd get some nice color. But when I metered up into the highlights, they were blowing out. So in this case, what I needed to do was wait until the lights were not so bright. Wait until the fountains changed their shape. So I kept my exposure and waited for the scene to slightly change in order to make a successful photograph. In this case, everything is showing detail in our frame, but the light isn't what we would want. And you can tell that by metering. The sky is a little bit brighter blue. It's kind of a hazy, partly cloudy day, and in this case the trees are behind a cloud. And when I metered that, I set it at +1. When I meter down into the tree, I'm getting a -2, which is a zone 3. So that's fine as far as exposure goes, but the look of it isn't that great. When the cloud moved away and the light pulled back in, I was now getting more of an emphasis on my main subject, and this becomes a secondary subject in the back. When I meter, sky is still +1, and the yellow is also +1. Now they're the same brightness, and we can tell that this is as bright as that, this becomes a more prominent feature in the photograph and makes a better image. In this shot, we can evaluate the light and realize that it's not a very good photograph. You can always begin by metering your average tone in the light. When I meter the statue, however, I'm getting a -2, which is a zone 3. And we could think, well, okay, that'll be good for the exposure, but is it going to make a good-looking photograph? When I meter up into the sky, again, it's not blown out, but it's bright white. So what you need to do is ask yourself, if my entire scene is really made up of very dark darks and very bright whites, is it going to make a good photograph? And if you squint your eyes and look at this scene, you're kind of getting the overall impression. A couple of black lines and some white splotchy areas in the back. Not a very compelling photograph. Here's a subject that you might not see every day, but the situation is not that uncommon. Bright white and dark black all in the same frame. So what do we do? Well, in following our mantra, we would look for a midtone value. But having never come across a bison before, you might not know where to find one. But we do know where the snow belongs, right? Zone 7. So, setting your camera at 1/125th places that tone. But when you put your meter down into the shadows, you realize they're underexposed. So what to do? Well, you could use a flash here, but that might not be the safest solution. So let's assume that through exposure we can't fix this problem. We can't retain detail in both the highlights and the shadows. So we have to make a decision. Which is more important, the bison or the snow? Well, I kind of think the bison is the main subject. So we want to have the bison exposed properly. So if we open up while continuing to meter the bison's face, we get to a 60th at 5/6, and now the bison's face will be in zone 3. That's a good exposure. It's very dark. The snow is blown out here, but that's all right. When your subject is so large in the frame, you can get away with having large areas of white space behind it. Not your first choice, but in a pinch, it works just fine. Here's a more common situation. And in this scene, you could take your meter reading off the average blue sky there and place that in zone 5. Continuing to check your highlights, you go down to the brighter metal and you see that that falls into a zone 6, no problem there. And then you go up and you meter the bright white sky, or the bright white cloud, and you find out it's overexposing. Well, it's decision time again. The rest of the scene looks very good. If you close down a little bit to bring detail in here, this is all going to become significantly darker. And you have to ask yourself, is that what you want to do? I think when a subject is this small, allowing it to be bright white without detail is okay. If it was larger, let's say filled this amount of the frame, then it would be to the point where you'd need to have detail in it. But in this case, I think you could let it go just as it is. In this scene, our highlight is really the light source itself. Light is streaming in from the outside, illuminating the interior. And so you take your meter reading, and you get a zone 5. But you think, I'm going to look at the highlights just to see what's happening. And when you put your spot meter over there, you find out that it's going to be overexposed. So you stop down to 1/125th at 5/6. It's still overexposed. Stop down again till you get to 1/250th at 5/6, and finally you'll have detail in the window. The question we have to ask ourselves is that the way we want the rest of the image to look? Perhaps you don't have a fill flash, or you don't have a powerful enough flash to fill the interior with light. Then this whole subject is overly dark. In a situation like this, you'll be better off with your first exposure, allowing this to blow out. When the white area is the light source itself, we're more accepting of it having no detail. And here we get the idea of light pouring in. And that's a good feeling. So 1/60th at 5/6, zone 5, let this blow out. So far we've talked quite a bit about metering different areas within your scene and checking your highlights and making decisions. But once you get the hang of the zone system, metering can be fairly quick. In this example, we know the background is going to blow out and be pure white. So our only concern is the main subject, similar to the bison. Well, our green is average. We take a zone 5 meter reading and take the shot. Here in this scene, the skier was coming at me very quickly, and I didn't have time to take a bunch of different meter readings. But there is one thing that I do know, and that's the snow needs to have detail. So I can put that right into a zone 7. Put my meter at my feet, change my exposure so the hash mark would be up at +2, recomposed and shot. When it comes to portraits, we just have to learn our skin tones. After that, we can just take a meter reading, and in this case, take it off the man's forehead, call that zone 6, and you're good. You can just shoot. Same thing here. She's the most important part of this scene, so whether the wall in the back is a little bit bright is inconsequential. Take a meter reading off of her skin, put it in zone 6, take the shot. Another simple exposure situation is sunsets and sunrises. They're almost always an average tone. If you take a meter reading right here, the average color, you're going to put it into zone 5. Now there is some brighter tones in here. The yellow might be up around zone 6, but everything else will fall where it may. Another example where you could just take the meter reading right off of your average tone and put it into zone 5. And again, we do have some lighter values around zone 6, up a little bit higher. Now in the next section, I'm going to show you how the histogram on the back of your digital camera relates to the zone system and how you can use it to double check your exposure after you've already made your shot.